You're watching Reason and Theology Live, a show dedicated to charitable discussions, debates, interviews, commentary, and analysis. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Chaotic Council of Ambiguity. Sounds familiar, right? Well, I'm not talking about the Second Vatican Council. I know a lot of y'all thought that I was. I'm actually talking about a different one of our councils, the Council of Ephesus. I've talked a little bit about it lately, but I want to talk about some more of the chaos and some more of the ambiguities surrounding it that led to some serious problems. Now, obviously, I, as a Catholic, accept the Council of Ephesus. I accept all of our ecumenical councils. And I adhere to them on faith and morals. But I'm pointing out that sometimes we are inconsistent. We will make accusations against the Second Vatican Council that we don't consistently apply elsewhere, which I've brought up before in previous shows, but I'm going to demonstrate that here. Usually, people who are accusing the Second Vatican Council of just being a mess filled with ambiguity haven't studied church history in really serious detail. I guarantee if you see somebody saying that Vatican II is just filled with ambiguity and that's the problem, ask them, have you really studied Ephesus, Chalcedon, Constantinople II, Constantinople III for that matter as well, in any kind of real detail? And I can bet you dollars to donuts, as they say, that they haven't studied it in any kind of detail, and they're not being consistent. They'll accept Ephesus, they'll accept Chalcedon, they'll accept Constantinople II, they'll accept Constantinople III, but not because they've really studied through the issues, but because they know as Catholic they're to adhere to it. So let's talk a little bit about it. First, before we can really talk about the Council of Ephesus, I briefly want to talk about Apollinarianism. You have an individual named Apollinarius who was reacting against Arianism. Arianism is the idea that Jesus is not consubstantial with the Father, one of essence with the Father. He's not fully divine. He's a created being who's just simply elevated to the title of God, but not actually God by nature, and not one nature with the Father. That's Arianism. Obviously, that's condemned at Nicaea 1. But you know history. Arianism still continued to prevail after Nicaea. Also, those who denied that the Holy Spirit is consubstantial with the Father prevailed, and because Nicaea didn't address it, so we then have to have Constantinople I in 381 that addresses the issue of the Holy Spirit, but it also condemns Apollinarianism. Now, what is Apollinarianism? Well, again, Apollinarius was trying to respond to Arius. So he's trying to do a good thing here. He's trying to be a good Orthodox Catholic, except he adopts heresy himself. Sound familiar? People who are trying to fight against heresy but end up adopting a heretical view themselves. Certainly sounds familiar today. And his heretical view was pretty subtle. It wasn't just blatantly obvious. It was pretty subtle, which also sounds familiar today. But effectively, Apollinarianism is this idea that the person of God the Word replaces the rational soul of the human Jesus. So when you have this, you kind of have a blending of the natures, the human and divine, because now second person of the Trinity, who is a divine person, is replacing a human aspect in Jesus, the man Jesus. That's a problem, because that means Jesus is not actually fully God and fully man. He took on an incomplete humanity, according to Apollinarianism. Again, he's trying to do this so that he can fight against Arianism and assert the deity of Christ. But here we have an overshooting, if you will, and an overcompensation against Arianism. And now we're doing detriment to the human nature. The problem here is, if Jesus is not fully human, he doesn't actually have a rational soul, then that means humanity's rational soul is not redeemed, because that which is not redeemed, or that which is not assumed in the incarnation, is not redeemed. So you have to have the entire humanity assumed in the incarnation and elevated to the divine in order to be redeemed. So that's the problem with Apollinarius. Now, guess what? You've heard of Nestorius, right? Guess what Nestorius is trying to do? Well, Nestorius is trying to also be a good Orthodox Catholic by refuting and rejecting Arianism and Apollinarianism. And when he hears people using the term Theotokos, Mother of God, he thinks that sounds problematic. And he hears people saying Anthropotokos, and he says that sounds also problematic. And what he's thinking is, some of this sounds Apollinarian. He thinks Theotokos sounds Apollinarian, and Anthropotokos sounds Arian. So he's trying to fight against two heresies there, Apollinarianism and Arianism. Might it be said that he overcompensates? I think so. He ends up reacting against Theotokos. Mary is the mother of God. He does it for two reasons. Number one, he thinks it's Apollinarian. Number two, he thinks that some people mean by it that she, that is the Virgin Mary, is the creator of the Trinity. And that's, the origin of the Godhead. That's absurd. That's not what we mean by Theotokos. That's the common Protestant misunderstanding. Well, that common Protestant misunderstanding goes back to day one. Later on, before the Council of Ephesus, he finds out, that is, Nestorius finds out that, no, that's not exactly what's meant. So he ends up writing a letter to John of Antioch saying, I accept Theotokos in the Orthodox sense, and it's the sense that we mean it. So he ended up accepting Theotokos in the Orthodox sense in his correspondence with John of Antioch. There's some other problems to his theology, though. So we often hear that he just rejected Theotokos. That's not fully true. He ended up accepting, like I said, even before Ephesus, an Orthodox use of the term. But he still had other problems in his theology, and he still had other things that he said elsewhere that he had not fully repudiated. And so some of that comes back to haunt him at Ephesus. So again, here Nestorius is trying to fight against heresy, but he ends up adopting deficient views himself. Once again, that should sound familiar to you, right? A lot of us are frustrated with the crisis in the church today, and we're trying to fight against liberals in the church, but what do? Sometimes we overshoot and adopt heretical views, heretical or schismatic views. Nothing new here. So there's a lot of chaos going on at this point. There are a lot of people saying Nestorius is saying this and Nestorius is saying that, and people accusing him of channeling Paul of Samosata, as we heard the other day. In a previous show, I discussed that, which is absurd. He was not channeling Arianism. Paul of Samosata was a form of Arianism before Arius, and Nestorius rejected Arianism very clearly. So but what it is people often interpret whoever they're listening to at that day and time, they interpret them in light of previous heresies. So the person who was accusing Nestorius didn't really know how to categorize him, so he just categorizes him according to a previous. heresy, because that seems to have a greater rhetorical effect. But it's not entirely accurate. The problems with Nestorius again lie elsewhere, not Arianism. You might say that the problem with Nestorius is whether he intends it or not, and I don't think he intends it. He's separating the natures, and that's a problem. And there's some other things that he's reported to have said, that he doesn't believe that a 3-month-old Jesus is divine, or he says, I would not worship a 3-month-old Jesus, something to that effect, which then says, okay, well, does that then mean that you think that the one that Mary gave birth to is not divine? So, I mean, you have a separate human and then a separate divine thing? Or does he mean that you can't give to the human nature what is owed to the divine nature? In other words, did he mean he just would worship Jesus as divine, but he wouldn't worship the humanity? I mean, I think he did have some concerns there about whether or not we can worship the humanity. And so there's some confusion there. What did he mean? He obviously doesn't really have a chance to explain himself, and I'll go over why here in a minute, because you have chaos going on with Ephesus. So he didn't really get a chance to clarify that issue, at least not at the time of Ephesus. You do have some writings of Nestorius that survive after Ephesus, assuming that Nestorius actually wrote it, which most scholars think he did, and that's going to be the Bazaar of Heraclides. And there we get his views, and he seems to accept the Orthodox understanding in the Bazaar of Heraclides, which is why a lot of people now say that Nestorius wasn't a Nestorian. Maybe, but Ephesus was certainly right in condemning Nestorianism. Now, whether Nestorius held to Nestorianism is something else. But we'll table that for the moment. But you can obviously see there's just a whole bunch of chaos already. It gets even worse because the Pope commissions Cyril to basically get Nestorius in line and tell him what he needs to accept to be in conformity with the Roman See. So Cyril's, has been writing letters to Nestorius. Nestorius is writing letters back to Cyril, and in these letters, it really seems like they're talking past each other. It's hard to not think that. It's hard to not see that. Yeah, both of y'all are confusing each other, and neither one of y'all are really understanding the other one very well here. But by the time you get to Cyril's third letter to Nestorius, he gives him 12 anathemas that he has to sign off on. Nestorius has to sign off on. And if he doesn't sign off on them, within 10 days receipt of the letter of the Pope, and, that's it for Nestorius. He's excommunicated by the Pope from the Universal Church and deposed by the Pope. So here you have an instance of papal supremacy in the affairs of an Eastern bishop. Okay, well, Cyril looks at the 12 anathemas and thinks it's Apollinarian, so he doesn't want to sign it. John of Antioch, who's friends with Cyril and thinks that Cyril's Orthodox, and Cyril thinks John of Antioch is Orthodox, catches wind of the 12 anathemas of Cyril, and he reads this and he thinks, Cyril didn't write this. I know Cyril is Orthodox, but I'm reading these 12 anathemas and they're Apollinarian. So John of Antioch doesn't think that Cyril, his friend, who he knows to be Orthodox, wrote the 12 anathemas because they sound Apollinarian. Now, is there fairness to the concerns that John of Antioch has here? Yes and no. Cyril is not an Apollinarian. Cyril rejects Apollinarianism, and I think that he does make it clear enough that he's not an Apollinarian, but the problem is, as I've mentioned before on the previous show, Cyril thought he was drawing on the work of Athanasius, but he was actually drawing on the work of Apollinarius. Or not Apollinarius, but an Apollinarian. So here you have an Orthodox saint who's not an Apollinarian, but actually unintentionally drawing on heretical writings to express his theological views. That sounds like a recipe for disaster. Can you imagine if any of this was going on at the Second Vatican Council? Well, might we make some applications for our time in reference to the Vatican II? People maybe saying things that are orthodox, but then using non-orthodox language to say it? Well, it gets worse because Ephesus itself also quotes an Apollinarian, actually Apollinarius himself, and it thinks it's a pope. So it quotes an Apollinarius as a pope and then approves of the quote, the orthodoxy of the quote, which means they approved of the orthodoxy of Apollinarius in that section, which heretics sometimes get it right. So, I mean, it's not a problem for Ephesus because the section that they quoted is orthodox, but they're mistaken insofar as they quote it as a pope, but it's actually Apollinarius. Can you imagine if Vatican II was quoting Arius and then quoted it as like Pope Pius X or something? Can you imagine how crazy the Radrads would go with that one? People aren't, I guess they don't think of these things. They don't really consider that when Vatican II was a whole lot better than you actually think it was compared to some of our other councils. It gets worse though. It gets worse. John of Antioch, back to him. He is looking at the 12 anathemas and he says, I think that this is Apollinarian. Because again, Cyril's unintentionally drawing on Apollinarian works. So anathema 11 in the 12 anathemas sounds Apollinarian to him. Now it's not. Cyril's not an Apollinarian. The 12 anathemas are not Apollinarian. But can you read them in a heretical way? Yeah, you could. You could also read them in an orthodox way. And I think that would be the fair interpretation. But again, there's some ambiguity there. And there's some reason to see why there's ambiguity there. Because again, he's drawing off the works of a heretic. So unknowingly. So might we have some weaponized ambiguity here? Not in his intention, that's for sure. He didn't intend it. But could not some of these things be exploited? Perhaps. Do these ambiguities confuse people? They certainly do. So John of Antioch commissions someone else to refute Cyril's work, not knowing that it was actually Cyril who wrote it, because he didn't believe his brother, who he knows to be Orthodox, would actually write this thing. Anathema 11, by the way, if you want me to just briefly read it, just so you have an idea of how it could sound Apollinarian. When I read it, I thought it was perfectly Orthodox, because I'm reading it with the hermeneutic of continuity. But if you read it with the radical traditionalist hermeneutic of suspicion, yeah, you could come away with, oh, this is heresy. If it says, if anyone does not profess that the flesh of the Lord is life-giving, the flesh of the Lord is life-giving, that's, the flesh of the Lord is life-giving? Now, you can understand that in an Orthodox sense. But you could also understand that to somehow wonder, is there a blending of the divine and the humanity here, to where we're now elevating the humanity to where it's divine? Are you mixing the natures? That sounds like Apollinarianism. Well, it's not, but you could see how somebody in this day and age would have read this and thought that the flesh of the Lord is life-giving and belongs to the very word from God the Father, but professes that it belongs to someone other than him, joined to him in dignity and enjoying no more than divine indwelling, and not rather that it is life-giving, because as we have said, in its very coming into being, it belonged to the Word, who has the power to give life to all things that'll be anathema. Again, I can read that in an Orthodox way, but John of Antioch and others are reading this as Apollinarian, because again, the way Cyril's expressing himself, he's drawing on the works of an Apollinarian, not knowing it. So Cyril is confusing people unintentionally. Obviously, John of Antioch doesn't want to say that's Orthodox. Nestorius isn't going to want to sign off on that because he thinks that that's heretical. Well, it's even actually more confusing from Cyril, because a few years later, after Ephesus, you have more confusing language from Cyril. So now you have the figure who's Orthodox at the Council of Ephesus saying things that could really be misinterpreted. They're Orthodox, but they could really be misinterpreted. For example, in his letter to Sacensis, I think this is his first letter to Sacensis, you have language like one incarnate nature of the Word. Now, you can interpret that in an Orthodox sense, which is how Cyril meant it, because he's an Orthodox saint. But you could also interpret that heretically, right? Because what is it that we actually believe? Well, we believe that Jesus has two natures, one fully God, one fully divine, and they're united in his person. It's called the hypostatic union. So two natures, one person. Well, here he's saying one incarnate nature of the Word. One incarnate nature. Some people might think, wait, what do you mean by nature here? Well, what he means by nature here doesn't negate the two natures. And he, again, elsewhere confirms it doesn't negate the two natures. We can speak of two natures. We just have to be careful to not speak of them in a way that's Nestorian, that would separate the two natures. So it's a balancing act. We can speak of two natures, fully God, fully man, but we need to speak of them as united after the incarnation, never separated or divided. That's obviously the Chalcedonian formula, which is why Chalcedon has to give us this, because there's some confusing language from Cyril that Ephesus did not fully address. So Ephesus has some loose ends that are, not fully tied up here, and it's confusing people. And people are thinking, oh, well, I guess there's just one nature and not two natures. And people are really confused by that. So Chalcedon has to address that. No, there's two fully God, fully man, two natures, one person. So you have the Chalcedonian formula at Chalcedon. But that's, again, confusing to people, because they're thinking, but the Chalcedon's now rejecting Ephesus, and Chalcedon's rejecting Cyril. And so you have a huge schism there. The Oriental Orthodox kind of end up going their way, because they think that we're Chalcedon, and us Chalcedonians are not being fair to Ephesus and Cyril. They think that we're deviating from Ephesus and Cyril. And you can see partly why they would think that. Obviously, I don't think they're right, but you could see why they would have that kind of confusion. And there's all kinds of other political issues going on at the time, further causing the confusion and breakdown of language and stuff like that. But it's certainly the case that you have a major schism here over misunderstandings with words and ambiguities with words. You also have a major schism after Ephesus with the Assyrian Church of the East, because of some other issues, which we're going to look at here in a moment. But just to point out that this language of one incarnate nature of the Word, though Orthodox, could be misleading to some people. I'm going to share my screen. Take a look at this. You might recognize this as the Summa Theologica of Thomas Aquinas. In one objection of Aquinas, now obviously Aquinas doesn't agree with the objection, he just presents it. He has to engage Cyril's language. In other words, he has to admit that some people are confused by Cyril's language, and here's what Cyril actually means by it and doesn't mean by it. In other words, the fact that he has to put it in an objection shows that Aquinas recognized you could interpret Cyril's language in an orthodox way or a non-orthodox way. And so here we have to address the confusion. It would seem that the union of the Word incarnate took place in the nature. Well, now we believe it took place in the one person, right? Not in the nature, because that would be making two natures into one nature, and that would be blending the natures. That would be Apollinarianism or another heresy that came a little bit later. For Cyril, he is quoted in the Acts of the Council of Chalcedon, Part 2, Act 1. We must understand not two natures, but one incarnate nature of the Word. Now, when Cyril says this, could you misinterpret that? Not two natures, but one incarnate nature? Could you interpret that to mean Jesus no longer has two natures after the incarnation? Could you interpret that in a heretical sense? Yes. Yes, you could. Is Cyril, our champion here of the Council of Ephesus, ambiguous? You could say that, but I think that if you consider his whole corpus, no, he's not ambiguous. You just need to read what he says elsewhere. You just need to take him in context, and I think it's clear he's establishing what he's saying, and what he's saying is orthodox. It's just that, again, the language could be misunderstood if you're not fully considering him. Does that sound familiar? Remind you of Vatican II? And he says, and this could not be unless the union took place in the nature. Therefore, the union of the Word incarnate took place in the nature. Now, Aquinas doesn't believe that. He's setting that up as an objection. He's obviously going to go and refute it and show how Cyril is using the term nature here and how Cyril is orthodox. But again, you can see why some people would be confused. All right. You have this exchange letters between Cyril, Nestorius, Cyril, Nestorius, Celestine, Pope Celestine, Nestorius to Celestine, Cyril to John of Antioch to Nestorius to John of Antioch. You have just a whole bunch of letters back and forth. So-and-so is saying this, and then this is being said, and that's being said, and there's all kinds of confusion going on, and there's breakdown in language, and some are misunderstanding others, and there's poor communication in some areas, and again, there's just chaos going on. So the emperor calls a council, trying to deal with some of this. It was not, when it was initially called, it doesn't seem that he called it thinking that Nestorius would be in the hot seat, and Nestorius definitely didn't think it. He also wanted a council. So Nestorius didn't think that he would be in the hot seat either. Nestorius was fully on board with having a council because he wanted to clarify the chaos, because he was concerned that people were teaching Arianism or Apollinarianism. So he felt that it was necessary to address that issue in an ecumenical council. Now, the problem here is you have the Sacra of the emperor going out, calling the council, saying, you better come. And if you don't come, there's no excuse. And if you don't come, it's because you have a bad conscience. It's like, what if somebody is really unable to come? Are you sure you can say it's because they have a bad conscience? I mean, what if somebody's just completely financially unable to come, or there's wars going on, such as with the African bishops, with barbarians. Of course, they couldn't come because of that. So I guess they had a bad conscience, according to the emperor. Anyways, aside from the silliness of that part in the calling of the council, you have bishops from, all over trying to come to the council. And John of Antioch, along with a pretty large party from Syria and Mesopotamia, are traveling to Ephesus for the council. And some bishops from that area had arrived by the time that Cyril arrived. But Cyril arrives first. Cyril and, other bishops, maybe about at least 150 other bishops, little more than that, actually, had already arrived in Ephesus before John of Antioch. And they set a date. The problem is John of Antioch and a group of bishops from his territory were delayed because of difficulties in traveling. So John of Antioch writes a letter ahead to Cyril, who's already in Ephesus, saying, hey, I'll be there in a few days. We had difficulties. One of our persons died. A lot of the animals have died. We've had difficulties getting there. Here's why we're delayed, but, fret not, we'll be there in just a few days. Cyril gets this letter, and Cyril's like, you know what? Let me just go ahead and call the council now. And he takes some things that were said in the letter and interprets them to mean that John of Antioch's giving him the green light. John of Antioch, nowhere in the letter was given him the green light. And I don't think you could legitimately interpret anything that he wrote in that way. Be that as it may, Cyril interpreted it to mean, we can just go ahead and call the council before John of Antioch and all these other bishops arrive. It seems that the council was called at that time because he knew that John of Antioch would probably not agree with him. So he wanted to just go ahead and rush this thing before John of Antioch gets there so he can get it on the books. Nestorius is excommunicated. And let's do this before John of Antioch can get there. That seems to be what's really going on here. Now, even if we want to say, well, that's not exactly the case, although it really does seem that is the case. Should Cyril have jumped the gun here? No, he should not have. And jumping the gun here and calling the council prematurely, you might say, well, it's not premature. It was already supposed to have happened. Right. But John of Antioch clearly just told everybody he'll be there in a few days. Why would you just not wait a few more days for those bishops? Why are you creating this problem? It was not a good move, not prudent at all. But he goes ahead and he jumps the gun and calls the council, and a whole bunch of bishops write immediately protesting, saying, no, we're not going to participate in this. So there's a whole bunch of bishops already there in the city of Ephesus saying, no, you need to wait on John of Antioch and his contingent. Wait for him. We're not doing this. This is an illegal council. You're calling the council illegally because you're not waiting for them. And the emperor has already said that we don't need to have any rival councils. So what you're doing is illegal. And some pretty high up people are saying, Cyril, you can't do this. Don't do that. Immediately, you also have protests from people who are representing the emperor, telling Cyril and the fathers of the council at Ephesus, you can't do this. This is wrong. Well, but they go ahead and do it anyway. And they say, we've tried to reach Nestorius 3 times. We've summoned him to the council 3 times, 1 time on one day and 2 times on another day. And he doesn't want to see us, and he's not answering us, and he's avoiding the issue. So he has a bad conscience. The council just says, okay, he's deposed because he's been summoned 3 times and he hasn't come. So he is deposed according to canon law. Now for Nestorius, he actually tells the emperor why he didn't come. Again, the council father said it's because he has a bad conscience and he knows he's a heretic. Well, Nestorius tells him the emperor why he didn't come. And the reason why is not because he was afraid of discussing the issues, but because it was already agreed that the council would be like a full council with John of Antioch and all of them. So he felt that this smaller council that Cyril is holding is an illegal council. I'm not coming to that thing. I'm going to wait for John of Antioch, and we're going to have the council the way it should be done. So he doesn't come to it, but he's, been deposed. But he feels he was deposed illegally because Cyril prematurely calls the council and rushed it before John of Antioch could get there. So Nestorius never has an opportunity to explain his ambiguous writings, his theology. Nestorius again thought that they would have an opportunity to debate his theology, but it would be before a full council. And that didn't happen. And if you look at Ephesus in 431 in the June session, it seems that there was no actual debate that went on. We often have these ideas that the councils were just hashing out and considering theological issues and debating them back and forth. And that's not the case with a lot of our councils. Some of this stuff was dictated by emperors and we just accepted it. I mean, I'm thinking here of Constantinople too, where it's literally just dictated by the bishop. There's no discussions. By the emperor. There's no discussion on the bishops. The bishops just have to accept what the emperor says, period. That's Constantinople too. I mean, I accept it, but let's be frank. There wasn't a whole lot of debate going on. It was just basically accept this or else. There's not a lot of debate here in this session. Because obviously Nestorius isn't present. So they're just looking at his writings and they're just saying, this is heretical, and that's it. So he doesn't have an opportunity to defend himself, explain himself, say, oh, here's how I meant it, or let me recant. None of that. But again, he's deposed. What do you think happens next? What do you think happens? John of Antioch and his party arrive. What do you think happens here? By the way, let me see something in the chat. Apparently, after Ephesus, Nestorius wrote a book called The Bazaar of Heraclides, where he denies ever having held the views he was condemned for. Right, I said that earlier. I guess you didn't catch that part, but that's true. By the way, are you familiar with the argument of Ambiguity? Oh, goodness. Yeah, that book is just, I don't recommend it. That the bishop presiding over Ephesus wasn't in communion with Rome at the time, so papal approval wasn't necessary. The bishop presiding over Ephesus would have been actually, curiously, Cyril. Which is weird because there was no discussion on who was going to preside. That's what's curious. There was no discussion on who was actually going to preside, but it was assumed that Cyril would, because Cyril was representing Rome. So he signs first on the list. Although this is also happening before the legates get there, by the way. But that particular argument, the bishop presiding over Ephesus wasn't in communion with Rome at the time, so papal approval wasn't necessary. That one does not ring a bell. So I'd have to look over that, but that would be entirely irrelevant to his argument. So papal approval wasn't necessary. How does that engage Celestine and his perspective with Nestorius? Maybe I need some further clarification on the argument here, because it doesn't sound very convincing. Even if the bishop of Ephesus wasn't in communion, what does that have to do with papal ratification theory? I'm not following here, but I do know enough about him in that book that it's pretty dreadful and awful, and not. I don't take it seriously. It's clearly written as a polemical treatise to explain why he left Catholicism, but it's not well argued from the parts that I've seen. So I would take him with a grain of salt, but I'd have to see specifically what he's saying there and the evidence for that. I haven't seen any evidence that the bishop of Ephesus at the time was not in communion with Rome in any of the documents and proceedings. So maybe if we can get something more substantial, I'd be interested. Anyways, I think that all that's a red herring anyway, because it's not going to take away from the papal claims of papal ratification or intervention of the papacy and the affairs of Eastern bishops, as we see with Celestine and Nestorius. Okay. Let's see. Where were we here? Well, the next thing is John of Antioch and his party arrives. What do you think happens? Well, the fathers of Ephesus are like, so here's what we did. Why don't you just go ahead and read the minutes and sign off on them? You really think John of Antioch is going to do that? No. Because as soon as they arrived, they were already protesting this issue. So right away, guess what happens? John of Antioch calls a different council, a rival council. So now you have two rival councils, right? You have Cyril's party and then what's called the Eastern Party, mostly made up of Syrian and Mesopotamian bishops. And then a whole bunch of those bishops who had originally signed a protest against Cyril calling his council. They had joined John whenever he arrived. So you have these two councils going at each other. Sounds chaotic, right? Can you imagine if this happened at Vatican II? Rival councils going on. Well, I mean, we actually had something similar with the Council of Florence, which was originally, what was it, in Basel, and then it was Florence, and then it was Rome. I think it was also held in one other place, but the Council of Basel ended up turning into a schismatic council. So part of its sessions are ecumenical, and then part of its sessions are not. So it's kind of confusing there, because you then have rival councils, whereas some of their sessions are orthodox, some of them aren't, some of them are schismatic, and that one is just all over the place. And Constance, of course, is another one where you have rival parties going on at the same time. And so there's all kinds of chaos going on in church history. You really can't look at the history of our councils and just say, wow, this really worked out smoothly. There were problems all over the place. And you have to start making qualifications and fine-tuning your theology and fine-tuning your understanding of the councils to be consistent with some of this, with the craziness that surrounds some of our councils. Which is, again, why I say, I mean, people who tend to criticize Vatican II on the grounds of ambiguity and stuff like that, it's generally because there's a deficient understanding of the councils in any kind of serious detail. Well, you now have two rival councils going on. What do you think that causes? Well, that's obviously going to cause some divisions. And then there is war between, not a physical war, although there was physical problems between these two parties. Some monks beating up other people, and there's sins on both sides here. But anyways, Cyril and John of Antioch obviously have a falling out. They're able to patch it up a couple years after Ephesus in 433 with the union formula. But that doesn't really do it for everybody. And so you do have a schism with, again, some of the people in Mesopotamia, the Syrian Church of the East. And you have more chaos going on as a result of the confusion of this whole situation leading up to Chalcedon. And when Chalcedon, again, gives its formula, some people think, but wait, that's not what Cyril held to. It's not true. Cyril would have upheld Chalcedon. But some people thought that Chalcedon was rejecting Ephesus and was rejecting Cyril's teachings because he has that language of one nature. And here, Chalcedon is talking about two natures. So some people thought Chalcedon is Nestorian. It's Nestorian. You guys are Nestorian. Pope Leo in his tome, it's Nestorian. Well, it's not Nestorian. But you can understand why some people would have that kind of confusion with language barriers and ambiguities and political issues. That then again causes a schism with the Oriental Orthodox. Would some of this have been avoided if Cyril had waited and actually had a council with John of Antioch present and Nestorius present, and they would have hashed things out there? Who knows? Who knows how things would have unfolded? But we can certainly say that the premature calling of the council by Cyril led to further confusion, led to further issues, further division. And you could kind of see how some of this ended up leading to such chaos that you have these schisms. Might it have gone differently? Who knows? Who knows? But given how crazy all this is, how much chaos here you have here, how much ambiguity you have here, you can be a little bit more appreciative of Vatican II. When you actually read Vatican II, you can be a little bit more appreciative of it. Now, in some ways, we have more chaos than they did. In some ways, we don't. It just kind of depends on what we're talking about. But you can start to appreciate Vatican II a little bit more when at least we don't have rival councils going on, and we don't have our champion of the council then using ambiguous language, all kinds of stuff going on. Anyways, I hope this was helpful. Lewis says, by the way, I misremembered. It was actually the Council of Constantinople, not Ephesus. I found the original quote. We'll send you the relevant quote on Facebook. Okay, that helps. That helps. Is he claiming that the Bishop of Chalcedon wasn't in communion or something? I just need to see it. So yeah, send it to me. I'll look over it. Maybe I'll engage it in a further show, but I haven't found him to be helpful. I remember reading it when I was on my way outside of Catholicism into Orthodoxy and being unimpressed with it. So it's always weird, like when you're leaving Catholicism and you have to actually then go and defend mischaracterizations of Catholicism to Orthodox. And that's not just my experience. There's plenty of people who they're saying, okay, I'm leaving Catholicism, I'm going to Orthodoxy. They go and start to visit their local Orthodox church. They start to talk to people there, and people are like, you'll find Orthodox who are like, oh, so you're Catholic, you're becoming Orthodox. Oh, that's great. I love Pope Francis. Pope Francis is the best. I love what he says about gays, or I love what he says about then you have to start correcting them about what Catholicism actually says, or, oh, I love the fact that they've changed their view on this and that, and then you have to correct them. Well, the Catholic Church actually didn't do that, or, oh, it's just so crazy that the Catholics believe the filioque way. This was never believed by anyone. Then you have to correct them. Well, actually, that's always fun. All right, y'all. I hope this was helpful. I'll continue to do some more videos on Ephesus here in the future, but I wanted to briefly go over this one because I find some similarities, and also I find some aspects to the situation with Ephesus to be more chaotic than some aspects of Vatican II, believe it or not. All right. Again, hope y'all enjoyed it. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Check me out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology. See you later. God bless. Oh, wait, before you go, I would really appreciate it if you would consider supporting this channel. This is my primary means to provide for my family, and it also helps me to produce content like this video. If you would like to support me, become a patron by visiting patreon.com/Reason and Theology. You'll also get access to extra exclusive content when you become a patron. Lastly, hit that like button and the subscribe button, and be sure to leave a comment down below. God bless.